All right. I want to say good evening to the audience, and this is a supplement to my lectures that I've been doing on the four elements of self-knowledge and the African American experience. And what we're doing is we've created a paradigm of thought and applying it to the African American experience. We didn't originate it, we didn't start it, but we have applied it to the African American experience, and hopefully it helps in the discovery of self. So we ask the question, what is our origin, what is our meaning, what is our morality, and what is our destiny? And in coming into knowledge of self, I think that there are several books that illustrate to us how an intellect is born, how someone leaves childhood to adulthood as far as uh, their maturity level and intelligence is concerned. And we see that in the life of Frederick Douglass. And I want to read to you a little bit from his narrative and glean from it and identify some books that we use in our class and some books that could be of use to you in your quest for self-discovery. And this is Douglass. He is moved into the home of Mr. and Mrs. Auld. And the scene is that the mistress, Mrs. Auld, is teaching little Freddie, if you would, some letters and some numbers and some words at the breakfast table. And Douglas's master walks in and basically has a fit because he understands the relationship between slavery and freedom and knowledge and ignorance. And so what I'd like for the reader to do, I'd like for my students to do, is to focus on Mr. All's response to the revelation that Douglass is learning how to read, and keep in mind that this event in history is critical because Frederick Douglass was one of the major intellects that diffused, if you would, the slave trade. And so it shows the power of knowledge. It shows how important it is for us to learn, because you never know the potential that someone has. So education is critical, and it's critical to the liberation of a people. So let's go ahead and get started. He says, very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABCs. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at his point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave how to read. And so a lot of people don't know that in America it was illegal for African people, for slaves to be taught how to read and write. And there was various punishments associated with a slave being caught with a book or being caught sticking his or her nose where it didn't belong, typically in a book. And so the relationship that black people have had, African people, enslaved people have had with knowledge has been critical, because the more knowledge we've had, the better we could use that information to our own benefit. And I think one of the things that we have lost is that we have lost an understanding of the role that knowledge plays in our liberation. And so Douglass is teaching us here that not only was it illegal for slaves to learn how to read and write, it was also a threat to national security. It was unsafe because those slaves that were reading and writing were the ones that were typically the first to revolt and rebel. So there's a relationship between resistance and knowledge. And those, we could argue that those African people who were enslaved or imprisoned were those who were educated or seeking to be educated, were seeking to learn how to read and write, were more prone to do things or to engage in resistance type behavior, like run away, like kill their master, like kill livestock, like poison food, like do those types of things that could challenge the condition that they were in. So Mr. Auld instructed Mrs. Auld, among other things, by saying that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave how to read. To use his own words further, he said, if you give a nigger an inch, he'll take an L. Now that inch and L phrase, Douglass is going to reflect on that later on in his narrative because it kind of confused him. The master said that, Mr. Auld said that if you give a nigger an inch, he'll take an L. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning will spoil the best nigger in the world. Now, if there is ever a statement that I think that really needs to be analyzed, is that one, where the master says learning will spoil the best nigger in the world. And it kind of goes in line with, asking our question, what is a nigger? And how is niggerism, if you could use that term, defeated? Well, the master himself says that learning is what destroys a nigger. Learning is what destroys the nigger mentality. Learning and one's attitude toward knowledge and the use of that knowledge to better his or her circumstances declares war on a term and phrase that we use in African American literature called niggerdom. So we hear the master's ranting, and he says, learning will spoil the best nigger in the world. Now, he said, if you teach that nigger, speaking of myself, how to read, there will be no keeping him. It will forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. So what is about knowledge that makes one unmanageable? Well, one of the major observations that has been made, especially dealing with African American literature, is that the more the Africans learned, the less inferior they felt. And at the same time, taking orders from someone else less inferior or less intelligent than they were would be something that was just simply illogical and unreasonable and unrational. And so the unrationalness, the unreasonableness of surrendering to the leadership of people who do not know what you know or who are not an expert on you like you are becomes something of the past, and thus the slave-master relationship is broken. Because in that relationship, although the slave feel like he needs the master, it is actually the master who needs the slave. And so once the slave is brought to a knowledge of self and gets begins to get a fundamental understanding of his or her environment, that makes the master-slave relationship begin to dissolve. And we can say that the master-slave relationship still exists to this day because there are various areas that African Americans still refuse to tread in, basically in dealing with the quest to be independent of the system that has kept them in the situation that they've been in for so long. So Mr. Auld continues by saying, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. Well, if he's of no value to his master, who is he of value to? He becomes of value to himself. He understands his self-worth. And what type of system do we live in where other people appreciate our value, other people appreciate our contributions, but we ourselves do not? And that's what learning does. When we're learning about who we are as a people. We're learning about the events and circumstances that have shaped our environment. And as the late Dr. Bobby Wright, similar to my name, but instead of White is Wright, Dr. Bobby Wright wrote in his various writings, in his various books, that African Americans have to develop a study not only of themselves, but of their oppressors and what their oppressors have done, the techniques that they have used to keep the oppressed or the colonized in the situation that they're in. And so that's a part of the therapy, I think, that African American people need in dealing with the here and now. In order to deal with the here and now, we have to have an adequate, proper knowledge and understanding of what has taken place and what we have been exposed to and the conditions upon which we have been exposed. So Mr. Auld goes on to say, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it would do him no good, but a great deal of harm. And it's interesting that the master would say that knowledge, learning would do the slave harm. And we have to ask ourselves the question, how is that the case? How is it the case that knowledge will actually become something painful or something to be looked at in a negative sense? Mr. Auld says, it would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new special revelation explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. And he says something here, Douglas says something here, that I have not heard too many African American, too many African people in general say. And he came to this conclusion at a very young age in his life. And this is also important because the earlier we can teach our young people about themselves and about their culture and about who it is that they're dealing with, this colonial psychopathic system that we're dealing with, the quicker they can begin to heal and move forward and make logical and reasonable decisions that will positively impact their society. Okay, so Douglas says, he says that his discovery was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. Now, fellas, that's an awesome statement in it. He says he struggled, but it was his master's objection to him learning. Just to read a few words, just to learn the ABCs, it was his master's adamant objection that really galvanized in Douglas's heart and mind the fact that knowledge was the way to go, and that his people were being enslaved because they were ignorant. And that creation of an ignorant being was the mental enslavement that kept them in the situation that they was in. Because as we read in Douglas's narrative, violence was used as a means to an end, and violence was not used to do anything other than to create a psychological slave, to have the slave to accept his or her fate rather than fight, because the more violent they were to the slaves, the more the property was damaged and the less work they could do. So they had to create a slave in the mind. That goes back to the Greek system of the peculiarum and the Delphic manumission and all of those other forms of psychological enslavement that the Greeks had imposed in Greco-Roman times. But he says, I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. So when he understood who his oppressor was and the method that his oppressor was using to oppress him, he also says simultaneously in discovering the white man's power to enslave the black man, he also discovers the pathway from slavery to freedom. That's a powerful statement, and we thank Frederick Douglass for writing these words, because it gives us so much insight even today into our politics and into our economics and into those 9 points that Dr. Neely Fuller talks about, those 9 points of interaction that are so important. He says, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. While I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which by the merest accident I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatsoever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. The very decided manner with which he spoke, he strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction, served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. And so when we look at the struggles of African American people, a majority of the struggle has been for knowledge. And the whole point of segregation is to isolate African American people from the decision making, isolate them from the meetings and the centers of knowledge to where they can gain knowledge of the environment, and keeping them oppressed, which is keeping them in the dark and keeping them reactionary to the things that most affect them. He says, it gave me the best assurance that I might rely with the utmost confidence on the results which he said would flow from teaching me to read. What he most dreaded that I most desired. What he most loved, that I most hated. That which to him was a great evil, to be carefully shunned, was to me a great good, to be diligently sought. And the argument which he so warmly urged against my learning to read only served to inspire me with the desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both. That's a powerful, powerful statement. And so we hope that this has encouraged you, one, to read Frederick Douglass's narrative, but at the same time to understand the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. And that's a relationship that's seldom discussed and is seldom identified. And I have a book here. I'm going to step out of the way for just a second to go pick it up. I actually have two that I think that the student could learn from. One is called The Colonizer and the Colonized by Albert Memmi. A very good book, a very easy read. And he talks about that relationship, and he dedicates this book to the struggles of African and African American people, because those struggles are so related to the global struggle between the colonizer and the colonized. And basically we can glean from this book and other books three aspects to colonialism. Number one, the occupation of the lands of dark-skinned people primarily, because it is a global reality that the richest lands in the world are occupied or were originally occupied by people of color, regardless of whether they were in Asia, in Africa, in North America, South America, Europe, the islands, Australia, it doesn't matter. Those lands that were most rich in wildlife and in resources were also lands that African people dwelt, and those lands were also occupied eventually by colonizers. And those colonizers came to exploit the resources, both natural and human, and then they imposed their European culture upon the African people. And so this book, The Colonizer and the Colonized, is a great book. Also under this book here, my students call this the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's a call and response. And this book is excellent. This is what the primary document that I use in my classes, a call and response. This book is critical because it has in it, and I think it's one of the best, if not the best, compilation of African American biographies, short stories. It has lyrics to songs. It has speeches. It has debates in here. It has slave narratives. It has poems. It has songs. I mean, it has just a gamut of information that we can use to build, our model, to build our economic, social, spiritual, political model off of, and to show that our people are responsible for great art and literature is important. James Weldon Johnson said, "A people may become great by many means, but that greatness is only recognized by the amount and standard of art and literature that those people have produced." He said, "No great people have not produced great art and great literature." And A Call and Response is one of those books that proves that point. We also have The Wretched of the Earth, which is one of my favorite books by Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon is quoted a lot in my class, and he's quoted a lot in the other researchers that I'll mention and have mentioned. And this book is epic in my opinion because he gives not only a scientific, but he's able to illustrate in terms that we can understand that psychological relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. And so I would definitely request that this book be a first read, and it'll be a last read too, because you'll never put it down, and I can't get past chapter 1 really, where he talks about violence. I've thumbed through it, as you can see, and I've marked up and inked it up all the way through, but chapter 1 to me, chapter 1 and 2 really are excellent. So please get that. Also, the autobiography of Malcolm X, I will pick it up as well. It talks about really Malcolm X's journey as Douglas was talking about, from boyhood to manhood, from slavery to freedom. And basically what he and Douglas have in common, and what you're going to find he and other revolutionary personalities have in common, is their relationship to knowledge, their relationship to reading and writing and becoming an intellect. So really, you know, in my opinion, that slavery has more to do with the intellectual aspect, with the mind, because resistance, physical resistance, results from the growth of the mental, in my opinion. And so we see that illustrated throughout our history and our culture. That's why so much was placed on reading, and in my opinion, that's why so many of the laws and the social norms were done to isolate African people from knowledge, because, well, once they got knowledge, they got violent. And they got violent because they didn't consider themselves inferior to someone to whom they felt themselves intellectually equal. Also, another book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, by Walter Rodney. This is an excellent book. Walter Rodney was a revolutionary educator whom they eventually had to kill. They had to assassinate him. And any educator that they had to assassinate, hey, it's high on my book. That meant he was getting close. And he talked about the dependent relationship, the exploitative relationship that Africa had with Europe. And basically Europe obtained everything that it has obtained today through the pillage of Africa. And when it's time to talk about reparations, we're not only talking about, and I think it's very short-sighted, and I have a picture here of some early personalities in the reparation movement. Cindy Owens dropped this picture off to me, and who is in the center of the picture there, and they were a part of those early meetings on reparations. And of course we have to bring in Cobra their contribution. But Walter Rodney basically helps us to understand the relationship between the land and the intellectual property and the people. Okay, we can talk about compensation for wrong, but if no land has come from it, if there have been no real and intellectual gains as a result of the reparations, the money will fleet just like with everything else, because it's just pure mathematics. But the science of wealth, the science of the technology, the occult technology, if we can call it that, that has kept African American people in the situation that they're in. This book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, is a good scientific look at how that happens. I'm going to breeze through a couple of other books. Haven't had a chance to do much in them. The White Boy Shuffle by Paul Beatty. White Boy Shuffle, that's a very easy read. Another one, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And this is important. This book is critical because we have a lynching memorial here in Montgomery, and Alabama State University, which is where I teach, is just right across the street, right down the block rather, from the lynching memorial. And so you have thousands and thousands of people coming to the lynching memorial to, you know, every week, every year. And, you know, everyone approaches the topic of lynching as if it was a mystery, as if it was a part of hidden history. And how could that be when all your lynchings were public? And they were done ceremoniously and symbolically to where hundreds, if not thousands, of people were able to participate in it. And one of the words W.B. Du Bois objected to being used just to make mention of a gathering is a picnic. Well, a picnic historically was a lynching. You picked a nigga and you lynched him. And so James Cone brings up the symbolism, or the lack of the use of the symbolism of the lynching in reference to Christian theology in his book. It's called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And I want to read just a little bit of it to you. He says, the lynching tree, so strikingly similar to the cross of Golgotha, should have a prominent place in American images of Jesus' death, but it does not. In fact, the lynching tree has no place in American theological reflections about Jesus' cross, or in the proclamation of Christian churches about his passion. The conspicuous absence of the lynching tree in American theological discourse and preaching is profoundly revealing, especially since the crucifixion was was clearly a first century lynching. Okay, excellent. This book is personal to me because it was written by church member of mine, one of the associate pastors at my church, Montgomery City of Refuge, and the book is interestingly entitled Refuge, and it is about he and his wife's perseverance and survival during the Civil War in Liberia. Very excellent book because it covers so many different aspects of African independence. He talks about the loss of his family members due to the Civil War, how the Civil War changed he and his family, the dynamics of Liberia, and his relationship with the African diaspora as a whole. I would definitely pick this book up. It's called Refuge, The Story of Faith and Civil War, and it's by John and Bessie Gonley. Excellent, excellent read, and they're local authors here in Montgomery. So I've got two more that I'll mention, and then we'll finish for today. The Color of Money. Man, we need to know this one. And so with all of the television and all of the entertainment around what wealth is and what's not, our people are being painted a false picture of the economic realities, and we can't participate in those economic realities because we've not gotten an economic education, because we don't have knowledge of self. Everything centers around your perception of yourself and your self-worth. And one of the things is that you do not empower your oppressor. You do not take your money and give it to people who hate you. Martin Luther King talked about that in his speech, Where Do We Go From Here? In his book, Where Do We Go From Here? In his analysis of Operation Breadbasket. You don't give your money to people who hate you. And so you use your money actually against the people who hate you. So when we talk about the color of money, it is a eye-opening look at those economic conditions that keep African Americans where they are, and at the same time it gives us a great economic education on how to follow self. Okay, Education and Equality. This book is a book that deals with and attempts to define what education equality really is, and compare the concept of equality in education with the concept of equality in other areas of American society. And so this book is good because it has a lot of good references in it that you can use to prove or disprove your point. So these are some books that researchers are using, and we're using these in our classroom as well, our discussion. So we hope that you have learned something from what we've talked about during this session. And fellas, do you have any questions or any comments or anything that you want to respond to before we sign off? No? All right.
Just, Dr. White, just stress, you mentioned these different books.
Mm-hmm.
Stress the importance of reading and writing again for our audience.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, when I was in high school and college, I was not a reader. Okay, I didn't become a part of the literary world really until my senior year in college, law school on, and it was because my environment didn't require it. Now I could read and write, and I could pump out an essay if I needed to. I could, I wasn't functionally illiterate like a lot. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like a lot of our kids are. A lot of our kids are functionally illiterate because reading and writing and mastering it takes time. Now I'm no master at it. I'm no master at writing. I've written a couple of books and helped people write books and write research papers and those type things. But I didn't start off that way. But what happened was I fell in love with it. I actually fell in love with reading, and I began to understand the relationship between reading, writing, and me in my career and helping people, because the knowledge that I use it to help people. And when you have a desire to help people, and that transformational aspect is why I've taught for 26 years, is because I see the transforming effect that knowledge has on students. They come to my class one way and they leave a totally different way, and to impress upon them and for them to better understand the fact that their future has more to do with what is written down. Reading helps you with your patience. It helps you with your speaking. It helps you with your writing. If you're a good reader, you're going to be a good writer. And if you're a good writer, you're going to be a good speaker, right? So that relationship is important. So it helps you, to develop as a person. But you have to get environments that really require you to know something. And that information has to be critical. So, we're talking about our people. This is an epistemological argument. We're talking about our people being close to knowledge itself, right? Now, you notice I didn't mention school.
Right. Exactly.
You notice I didn't mention that. I didn't mention school because a lot of what we need to know, they don't teach in school. School is boring to some people. School is not even necessary for some people because they feel like the information that they're getting is not critical. But here's where I challenge them on that. You still have to pick up the basics. You still have to learn subject-verb agreement. You still have to learn how to write an essay. You still have to learn the theories and the theses that are out there because you're going to have to confront them as well, right? But if you are passionate about changing your people's community and your people's environment, you're going to embrace information. And that's going to lead you to the school, and you're going to appreciate the degree you do get. You'll see that not as having arrived at anything, but your degree becomes a tool of transformation. So the temptation is for it to become a tool of transaction only, which means you use that degree or whatever to make money, and that's it. You're not trying to help people, and you're not even going in with the intention of trying to help people. So you, as Carter G. Woodson said, you become a part of the problem, right? So we're looking at using information as a means of problem solving. And that's why, if I can go here for just a minute, that's why African American people should not divide the STEM from the social sciences. Because when you divide STEM, which is the science area, from the social sciences, which is also sciences, what you're saying is that black people should not use critical thinking and the scientific method to solve their problems, which means that the social problems only become emotional issues, and not issues that are to be solved in a scientific way. So for black people, STEM and the social sciences are one and the same. And our research shows that even the social sciences is one of the top feeders into the STEM programs at the post-secondary level. So you'll have people coming out of the humanities going to medical school, you see. And so understanding that with African American people, it's not either or, it's both and. So the STEM people on the STEM side of the campus, if there is a such thing, have to get back in tandem with the social science people so we can come together to collaborate on issues regarding the environment. Martin Luther King's words, in my opinion, have more to do with the environment, than anything else. Because in his latter days, his observations that he was making, the words that the statements that he was making, represented to me a moral equivalent of where we're headed technologically, which means his words would provide a balance, between making money and keeping people alive. The issue of profiting financially versus making life better for mankind. So right now that's off the scale now because we have so many unethical things going on in our economy now, probably more than ever, and that's because we lack a moral equivalent. And I think the words of Martin Luther King are the best to insert that moral equivalency into our economic acceleration.
Let me ask you one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned critical thinking. Now, a lot of us, like you said, are functionally illiterate. Should the critical thinking only begin in college, or what level should our young people be introduced to some of this literature?
Well, I think that we should be introduced to things that teach us about self, even in the womb. I mean, I think mothers can speak to their unborn children, and rub them in the womb and say, baby, you are going to be somebody. You are somebody. You are a mighty person. You're precious in my sight. You are this, you are that. Because mama's really the first teacher. You'll learn about mama before you learn about anybody else. And so mamas, we get the term alma mater from, you know what I'm saying? The young mother is the teacher, right? So you can have a teenage unwed mother, right? 15, 16, or whatever, even younger than that, because our young people started having babies very early in life. That's a part of our colonization experience. But she has the power to mold and shape her son and daughter, into consciousness by validating who they are, by constantly reminding them how beautiful they are, and then tell them why they're beautiful, what it is about them that's beautiful. Teach them to observe nature. Nature for us is mama teach us about nature. so mama can take her children on nature walks, and that's in the front yard. There's enough nature, even in Bed-Stuy. There's so much nature if you know where to look, And so we start with young people. We start with children. The younger the better. It really doesn't matter. And when they get time to speak, and they get time to read, and they get time to, you can have picture books in the home, because children, if they see positive images of themselves, in pictures and so forth, and they can watch movies that are positive, videos that are positive. We got cartoons now that are positive. They learn that positivity first, you see. And so it's those types of things that we do. And so we have to be conscious of the role that education plays. That's what, we have to be conscious of that. We have to be assertive in it, proactive in it, And at every stage of development, we insert more and more information, about who we are. Like, all of my favorite, most of my favorite educators are African American educators, and their research, my favorite research. I make reference to it. I make reference to the same people, the whole time, because I think that they're the ones that got this thing right, if you would. And then you can tell those people who were simply trying to sell books or trying to, get in with certain schools or certain researchers or whatever. You can tell, because they're going to cater and cower, in certain things. But, there's some researchers out there that hit the nail, in my opinion, right on the head that we can build, self-esteem from.
All right.
Yep. All right.
All right.
Peace.